Color wheels are the most basic color grading tool you can find in pretty much every post-production software on the market. They are a very powerful tool, and if you use them wisely, they can be the only tool you need for your color correction. I started doing color grading in 2008, at the time using Apple Color, which was a program that was included in Final Cut Pro. Color had the same exact wheels that you find today in DaVinci. In all these years, I always find myself relying on the color wheels for most of my color grading. And I can probably correct a whole project only using the color wheels and maybe another couple of tools like the HSL keys or the power masks. And since all these tools are present in all editing and color grading software, I think it's a good idea to learn these tools very well and trying to avoid using overcomplicated new tools that appear in color grading and that we don't know if they're gonna stick or not in our pipeline. This is to say that it's not important to learn every tool you have at your disposal, but it's way better to find the tools you like and just learn to use them very well. Now let's see the three main color wheels you have at your disposal in DaVinci Resolve. You can download the clips I'm using in this tutorial from the link in the description. You'll find the wheels in the third tab on the bottom left of the program. On this page, you have two types of wheels at your disposal. The default one is called color wheels, and it is the most common one in other programs as well. The second one is hidden in this tab here on the right, and it's called log. They do the same thing, but they work in very different ways. To see the difference, let's look at the effect on a grayscale, starting with the color wheels. The wheels cut the image into three parts, depending on the luminosity of each pixel. The first wheel is called lift, and it controls the darker part of the image and the black point. The middle one is called gamma, and it controls the center of the image, where the middle gray is. As most of the image is usually in the middle of the spectrum, the gamma wheel is the one that has the strongest effect on the image. The third one is gain, and it affects the brighter parts of the image and the white point. Then the fourth one is offset, which is a control of the overall image. Each wheel has two ways in which it can modify the image. Let's look at the first, which is the exposure control, the wheel right here. I'll grab the one from gamma. If you pull it to the right with your mouse, the image becomes brighter, starting from middle gray. If you pull to the left, the image gets darker. Each wheel has its exposure controls. As you can see, the three controls drag the whole image up or down, as if the image was an elastic band. Offset, on the other hand, just slides it upwards or downwards. Let's now switch to the log tab and see how it behaves. At first sight, the log wheels appear identical. Here too, the image is split into three parts, which are named shadow, midtone, and highlight. Let's try to move the exposure wheel in midtones and see what happens. As you can see, the midtones just move the section of the image that is the midtones. The same happens with shadows, which just moves the lower part of the image, and highlights, which just move the upper part. This is because log wheels cut the image into three segments that do not interact with each other. The cutting point are indicated by the range parameters. The first indicates where shadows and midtones are cut. The second where midtones and highlights are cut. What we can learn from this is that the color wheels can be used as a stronger and usually more forgiving correction. The log wheels are a more precise tool, which can be very messy if used inappropriately, especially when using the midtone controls. Let's now see a practical use for the two exposure tools. Here's a clip that was shot with a Sony FS7 in S-Log3. I'll place the LUT conversion in a node, then I'll create a node with Shift+S before the LUT conversion, and I'll call this node Exposure. This is where I do the exposure controls. What I can see in the waveform is that the clip is a bit overexposed in the windows here, but not too much. The blacks are a bit high, but the overall clip is well balanced. What I'd like to do is to make this scene a bit darker and moodier. So I'll grab the gamma wheel and I'll drag it to the left to make it darker. The whole image gets quite dark. Then I grab the lift control and push up the blacks, which are now a bit too dark. Okay, I like where the image sits now. Let's now go to the log page and go on from there. I'll create a new node and call it log exposure, so I remember what's inside. The first thing I do is bring the image into a more filmic range, and what mostly gives it away is the brightness of the windows, which are almost 100%. Usually in film, highlights sit between 70 and 80%. So I grab the highlights and pull the white level down. This way, I decrease the whole contrast, but without affecting the brightness of the midtones. The last thing I can try here is to move the midtones around in the log and try to place them where I like. Here you need to be careful because it is quite easy to make weird artifacts. Okay, the image looks more filmic to me. The next step is to start thinking about color, but let's do another example first. This next image is quite overexposed. The first thing I can do is bring the whole image down to a better exposure. So I grab the offset and bring the whole image down. Then I'll just play with the lift and gamma to place the image where I like it. I ended up pushing up the gamma and lowering the lifts. I don't really follow logic here, I just go by heart. Next, I create the log exposure node. This time I'll bring the highlights to about 90% since the image is brighter and it would look weird if the highlights were too dark. Then I bring the shadows up a bit because I don't want them to touch the black level. A bit of back and forth, and here's the final place for my luminosity. The image still has a lot to be done, but this is already a nice place. So, to recap, the color wheels are great for fixing general luminosity and defining the contrast of the scene. They are more forgiving, so you can make bigger adjustments. The log wheels instead work better for minor adjustments, such as placing a cap on the highlights or placing the black levels where you want them. They are not as effective for a more general luminosity fix. The offset, instead, is useful as a first tool to roughly place the exposure where you like it best, without modifying the contrast of the clip. Let's now use the wheels for fixing color. I'll create a new node after log exposure with Alt+S, then rename it color balance. To affect the color, you need to grab the dot in the middle of the wheel and push it toward the direction of the color you want to add, or the opposite direction of the color you want to take out. Double-click on the dot to reset the wheel, exposure included. The knob can be quite sensitive and do a lot of changes with minor movement, so when starting out, I suggest using the old-school method of moving your hand in slight increments at 90 degrees angles. So for example, you go first down, then right, then down again, and so on until you find the color you're looking for. If you mess up, it is easier to double-click to erase the correction and start again. In the color wheels, you have the same division of color based on the luminance of the image. The lift affects the blacks, the gamma affects the midtones, and the gain affects the highlights. Since most of the image is in the gamma, gamma is the wheel that applies more color correction to the image. The offset, on the other hand, just moves the whole image around. I don't usually use it, as it introduces unwanted colors in the highlights and shadows. I use the gain knob if the part of the image I want to change is mostly in the highlights. For example, if I want to have a warmer sunlight. I usually don't play with colors in the lift, as it is a good idea to have clean blacks. For a more precise control, you can also move the sliders for each value. The sliders move the color along a single axis, going towards or away from the color. Red moves along the red-cyan axis, green along the green-magenta axis, blue along the blue-yellow axis. The same principle applies to the log wheel. Let's look at a practical use. This image has a slight green tint that is not very pleasant. You can see it clearly in the waveforms along the wall of the room. Let's correct it. Moving the knob of the gamma towards magenta, I align the waveforms, so the image is back in the right place. I can also do it by dragging the green value below gamma until the waves align and the image looks okay. Now the colors are balanced, but I don't want to stop here. I'd like to give a warmer tone to the image. So I create a new node, call it tone or tint, then grab the wheel and move everything towards a warmer color. As you can see, the image gets warmer and the highlights waveforms get misaligned again. So I grab the gain wheel and correct the spill. I then go back and forth until the color is where I want it to be. Let's look at a before and after. The image is now better exposed, the warm tone suits the image and the highlights are not too high in the waveforms. Let's now check the skin tones. In the scopes, I change the view to vector scope. Then open the menu and check the skin tone indicator. A line appears in the graph. This is the reference to where the skin generally sits in the color wheel. Now I can use the qualifier to see if the skin is in the right place, which it is in this case. If you don't see the qualifier, open the 3-dot menu and check Display Qualifier Focus. Let's now focus on the last tweaks. I create a new node and call it Blacks. Here I'm going to fix any spill or tint in the shadows of the image. In my case, I want to add a bit of color separation in the image, and I don't really like the warm tint the trousers have. So I grab the shadows knob and move it towards a bluish cyan color. Now the trousers stand out a little more, and the image appears a bit more contrasty since I added some color separation. A generally good idea is to keep the blacks desaturated and dark, to give the image a natural look, but you can do whatever you like, as long as it looks good to you. Here is a final before and after. Let's now look at the second example. This clip is already quite balanced, but I want to make it darker and colder. Let's start with the tone. I create a new node, rename it, then grab the gamma knob in the color wheels and push it towards cyan. Then I create my blacks node and reduce the spill in the blacks. As always, a bit of back and forth is necessary to create the desired effect. Here I also added another node for exposure, because I felt the clip was too contrasty. I also opened the key tab where I decreased the overall opacity of the nodes by reducing the key output, which is a way to reduce the effect of a single node. After a few tweaks, here's the look I settled for. It is much moodier and darker with less color variation. Compared to the original, it is quite more filmic. From here, I would normally do a bunch of secondaries to reduce the color variety and lighten up the skin tone, but that is for another tutorial. Here we are sticking to color wheels. I'll just quickly add another primary to fix the grade and clean up colors. Then open the curve tabs and browse to Hue versus Hue. This tool allows you to change the hue of a particular part of the spectrum. With the qualifier on, I click on the dress of the image and see where it is. I make the selection a bit wider and drag the dot towards cyan. Then I do the same with the skin to make it warmer. Then I go to the second tab, which is Hue versus Saturation. Here I click on the dress and make it less saturated, while I increase the overall saturation, apart from magenta. Lastly, I open the Hue versus Luminosity tab, select the face and drag the luminosity upwards. After a bit of back and forth, I reduced the color spectrum of the image and made it more coherent. This is the final before and after. A great feature of using only primaries is that I can quickly copy and paste the grade to another clip, and it mostly works with a couple of exposure tweaks. Before moving on, let's recap. You can use the color wheels to fix white balance by moving in the opposite direction of the tint you want to take out. You can also use the wheel to add a color where it is not there. The gamma knob in the primary color wheels is the one that affects the picture the most. The log wheels are useful to take out unwanted spill color and make the blacks and whites cleaner. As a bonus, you can use the hue selectors in the curves tab to tweak the color balance of the whole scene and fix any unwanted tint or saturation. Let's now take a look at the other color wheel tab we have in DaVinci, which has the HDR lettering in the logo. HDR stands for High Dynamic Range, and it works in a luminosity range that uses higher values compared to the normal range, which is called SDR, or Standard Dynamic Range. If you don't know what I'm talking about, watch this tutorial on how to set up your timeline. Anyway, higher dynamic range means that there is more definition between the lowest black and the highest white, which mostly translates into a more decontrasted, more detailed image. Let's use the grayscale and see what the HDR wheels do. The main difference here is that the luminosity values are cut into 6 parts instead of 3. You have 3 directly visible, plus another 3 that you can see by clicking on the circles here. These wheels get the image in a way that is in between the color wheels and the log wheels. The shadows correct the bottom half of the image, while light corrects the top half. Then highlight modifies the top 25% of the image, while dark modifies the bottom 25% of the image. Lastly, you have blacks, which touches the bottom 5% of the image, while specular only touches the very brightest part, which you cannot see in the grayscale because they go over 100% white. Another big difference between the color wheels and the HDR wheels is that saturation in the HDR is not connected with luminosity. In the wheels, if you add saturation, you tend to make the image brighter. In the HDR wheel, the color space works in a way that separates the two controls and makes adjusting saturation more accurate. Since the world is still mostly in SDR, I think the HDR wheels are a bit too complicated. I also noticed that most of my students tend to make a real mess when they touch the HDR wheels for the first time, so I always suggest to stick to the primary wheels instead. Let's now look at a practical use for the HDR wheels. This clip was shot with a red Komodo in the Italian mountains. The clip is quite overexposed and has a bit of clipping in the whites and on the left side. I'm converting the clip with the color space transform method instead of using LUTs. If you want to know more, watch my video on node structure. What I'll do first is bring the exposure back to a normal position, and I do so with a normal primarily color wheel adjustment, pushing down offset, lifts, and bringing up gamma. Now the clip sits correctly in the waveform, but the darker part of the image is quite dark and has lost most of its detail in the process. So I can now use the HDR to bring the detail back, without touching the brighter part of the image. I create a new node, rename it HDR, then I bring up the shadows, touch down the light and highlights to keep the image below 100%, then lower the dark. Looking at the before and after, you can see how the details are really brought back by the process. To finish, you can add a new node, go into log wheels and adjust the black point to slightly touch the 0% line. You can also adjust the highlights to cap the max luminosity at 90%. And here is the final image, which was corrected by using all 3 wheels: color primary for rough exposure, HDR wheels for adjusting contrast, and log wheels for final touches. So here are my conclusions on the wheels you have at your disposal in DaVinci Resolve. The first is to learn how to use the tools very well, because it's a tool that it's always been here and it's going to be here for a very long time. Specifically about DaVinci, the primary color wheels are a great tool to find a rough look very quickly and then later refine it with other more accurate tools. The log wheels instead are a great tool for minor adjustments, and the same stands for the HDR wheels. At least in my workflow, they are a tool for little adjustments. Lastly, I want to stress that it's a great idea to do most of your correction in primary nodes, so nodes that affect the whole image, so that it's much easier to copy and paste your grades and progress through your grade. If you're interested in learning new editing tricks, watch this video on the mid-word cut.